So I try to say this very carefully, particularly in the general messaging. And people ask, is osteoporosis reversible? And generally my answer is the causes of osteoporosis are reversible. So if it's a hormone thing, we always talk about hormone replacement, obviously risk benefit there. Is it a gut thing? Is it a nutrition thing? Is it like whatever? There are ways generally that we can reverse the causes of osteoporosis and the causes of bone loss.
Do you want to wake up feeling like you're stepping into who you're meant to be? Into the best possible version of you? What if I told you that the key to your best life, health, and happiness are all around you? You just have to find what works for you. I'm Hope Pedraza, and I believe that there isn't just one way to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that all you need is a little inspiration to make changes that last from the inside out. Each week, I'll be sharing tangible tips and inspirational interviews to help you on your journey. These are the steps to take to improve your life and live with purpose. This is Hopeful and Wholesome. Hey y'all, welcome back to the show. Today I have on the show Dr. Doug Lucas, and he is a health optimization physician. He's the founder of his telehealth practice, Optimal Bone Health, where he and his team help patients optimize bone quality, and they review genetics, they do extensive lab work and functional testing. Man after my own heart here, doing the functional lab testing. And he helps his patients get to the bottom of why and how they're losing bone and how to really optimize that. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We are talking all about osteoporosis prevention, how we recognize it, how we can take preventative measures, what we can do to really actually reverse things and really optimize our bone health, our bone density. He was actually a physician who was practicing in the traditional care model, and he left his role as an orthopedic surgeon so he could help his patients really understand why things were happening to their bones and to be able to avoid the surgeries that he was trained to perform in the first place. So I really love that he has really shifted out of the conventional medicine model to take a more functional approach to osteoporosis prevention and really optimizing bone health. So I'm telling you, this episode is full of so many good takeaways. So I want you to take notes. You might want to go back and listen again. He talks about what tests to get, what labs to get, nutrition, supplements, you name it. We're talking all things bone health today. And this is for any and all age. It's never too late, which we talk about. So take notes and let's jump in. All right, y'all, let's jump in here. I am here with Dr. Doug, and we are talking all things bone health today. And I was telling him before we hopped on, I'm so excited about this conversation because, I work with all women in my world, really, and there's always questions about bone health. So I'm excited to pick your brain and hear all the important things for you today. Dr. Doug, thanks so much for joining me.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Hope. I am super excited to be here. This is probably the most often talked about topic in my world. So let's get after it.
I believe it. Okay. So let me start with this is probably a loaded question, but I'm going to start with it anyway. Can you tell us, why are we losing bone? Tell us why.
Yeah, great question. So that is actually the question, right? Which is, I think, in my opinion, as an orthopedic surgeon in my background, we just assumed that people lost bone. And it was just one of these things of aging. Oh, you lose bone. Oh, women go through menopause, men lose testosterone, you lose your hair, you get fat, like all these things that we assume are going to happen as we age. And I think that from the longevity perspective, now in my new practice, I don't think that really most of those things are true. So, I don't think that we should be losing bone. And when we look at patients coming into the program and we say, okay, well, what's our primary goal here? The question is, why are you losing bone in the first place? That's what I want to know. Why are you losing bone? For a lot of people, it is hormone driven. And that's, obviously menopause drives that and loss of estrogen. But there are a lot of other reasons why women in particular are losing bone as well. And so that's our goal, is to figure out, okay, where is it coming from? So I'm happy to run through sort of like the big players there, but in general, it's very unique and individual. And that's why we have, everybody's different and the program's different for each person.
Yeah. I'd love to go through some of those heavy hitters if you want to kind of pick on the few big ones.
Yeah. So if you look at even the definition of osteoporosis, they'll say it is age-related bone loss. And then sometimes they'll kind of throw in this little extra bit, postmenopausal or due to estrogen loss, like something like that.
Yep.
And there's different definitions for different, organizations and so forth. So probably the biggest player for women, especially, is loss of estrogen with menopause. Now, there are some premenopausal and certainly perimenopausal women that will have low estrogen levels as well. There's one of those, we'll talk about like who should be tested and when, but certainly postmenopausal women, loss of estrogen is a big player. Loss of testosterone, again, part of that same process. Testosterone indirectly related to bone, mostly through muscle mass. That's a big player. And progesterone as well. People don't really think about this one, but progesterone actually stimulates osteoblasts, which are the cells that make bone. And so if you're not getting normal cycles, or if you're suppressing your cycles with birth control through most of your adult life, you don't get that surge of progesterone for the second half of the cycle. And so you can end up losing all of the potential bone building that you get over time. So that balance of hormones is really important. So I would say hormone optimization or loss of hormones is probably the number one thing that we address. Different ways to manage that, obviously. The next biggest thing I would say is diet. But diet is it's a challenging one because it's not just what you eat. That's obviously important, but it's also what your body's doing with it. So looking at the gut function, enzyme, like all of that stuff matters. I will argue that most women that come in don't have a good diet to start with, but so many of them don't absorb it anyway. Right. So it almost it wouldn't have mattered. So we really have to do both sides of that. So those are probably the biggest players. There are more.
Yeah, of course. I want to back up because are you telling us, Dr. Doug, that birth control can have an impact on our bone density?
Absolutely.
Okay. And I ask that because I talk about birth control a lot in my world. And I took it for years too. So I am just as guilty as most of the other women out there who it's like passing it out like candy out there.
It's so easy, right?
So it's so easy. Yes. Yeah. And it, quote, fixes the things, right? And we both know it doesn't really fix anything. But I just like to pinpoint that because we talk about there's the mineral imbalances and there's the gut stuff. There's all these other things. But now we can add another one to the list. And you're telling us that it affects your bone density too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a fair number of premenopausal women that are not in the bone health side, but more on the health optimization side. I mean, one of the number one things, I even have like a whole list of templated things that I say to people, and I have a whole thing on birth control because there are so many potential negatives and some very well proven negatives that really, I don't think anybody should be on it. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. I'm glad that you pointed that out for us. So, okay. You mentioned about testing. So what is the best way to test for bone? I guess there are steps leading up to actual osteoporosis, but what's the best way to test that we're losing bone?
Yeah. So I'll start with the imaging of bones. So people have heard probably about the DEXA test, and that's if you go to your doctor and say, I want to test my bones, that's what they'll order, right? So it's an imaging study. It is a type of X-ray where you lay down on a table and this little wand goes over you. It's a very low dose radiation X-ray, and it looks at your bone density really by way of your bone mineralization. The reason why I think that is a reasonable test is because it is abundantly available. Everybody, for the most part, has access to one, and it's usually inexpensive. Your insurance and Medicare will cover it if you're over 65. I would argue that's way too late. You should know before then. But it's generally available. There are a lot of weaknesses to that test, though, so it doesn't really tell you much about your bone metabolism. It doesn't tell you anything about your bone strength. It doesn't tell you anything about your bone quality. Just tells you about the mineralization of your bones, which is something, but it's not all of it. There is a fair amount of variability from machine to machine, meaning that if you live in a city in Texas and you're on one side of town and you get a DEXA, and then you go to the other side of town in the same day and you get another DEXA, you could get very different results. There's also a difference from operator to operator. So same machine, different tech coming in and running the test, you get different results. So there's some challenges in that because this system has made DEXA the gold standard for bone density, which means that you really can't challenge it. You can't say that anything is more accurate or less accurate, less accurate, but you can't say anything is more accurate than DEXA. So we kind of have to use it, even if it's not a great test. But again, it still has value. There are other imaging studies, though, that I would argue are better. There are a few different ones out there. The one that I like for people to look for if they're looking for one is an ultrasound study called an Echolight REMS. I don't know if you've heard of this, but REMS, REMS. So it's an ultrasound, can be done in office. There's no radiation. And I think it might be more accurate, but again, you can't prove that. But the great thing about it is it looks at both bone density or the mineral density, but also the quality of your bone. So it gives you a strength score. I think that's really helpful when it comes to the ultimate question, which is what is your fracture risk?
Right.
Because I don't really care what your T score is. That's what DEXA tells you, right? I don't really care what your T score is. I really want to know are you at risk of fracture? Because I want to prevent a fracture. I don't really want to prevent your T score from getting, whatever, because we're treating people, not numbers. So I think that's really important. To more completely answer your question, though, what else can you do? So away from imaging, there are some great blood tests that are available now. And I don't know, I haven't seen them available on the direct-to-consumer side. So there's a lot of things you can do direct-to-consumer now, but they can be ordered, certainly. So the two that we really like to use, there's one called CTX, and I won't even go into what that stands for. But basically, it is the marker of osteoclast functions. Those are the cells that break down bone, which sounds like a bad thing, but it's not a bad thing. You need that function. So CTX is a blood marker that will tell you how quickly you're breaking down bone. And then P1NP. P1NP is the marker of bone formation, so osteoblast function. And you want a balance of those two numbers. And so that's something that you can measure on a regular basis. We measure it every 6 months. And that's the quickest thing that we see is going to change when it comes to, are we improving people's bone? Those are the numbers we're looking at.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's really good info. Y'all go back and take notes on that because I feel like those are really important for y'all to know to test things. Okay. So when we're looking at, so we know how to test, right? Because I feel like I talk to a lot of women, and I mean, I say this about lots of things, but especially when we're talking about bone health, that the hormones are already gone, right? Like the hormones are, especially the older you get, like the estrogen's gone, the hormones are gone.
Yeah.
And that it's kind of like they get to this like point of no return, right? Is there a way, can you speak to like the reversal? Like, is there such thing as reversing it, right? Is there a point of no return where you're like, oh, we've lost all hope. There's no hope for you. Or is there a way to kind of like, can we rebuild things? Can we like repair things? Can we reverse things?
Yeah. So I try to say this very carefully, particularly in the general messaging. And people ask, is osteoporosis reversible? And generally my answer is the causes of osteoporosis are reversible. So if it's a hormone thing, and we always talk about hormone replacement, obviously risk benefit there. Is it a gut thing? Is it a nutrition thing? Is it like whatever? There are ways generally that we can reverse the causes of osteoporosis and the causes of bone loss. Whether or not we actually see improvements on DEXA, again, I'm not as interested in if I'm changing your fracture risk. But what I will say is that we do see people that have improved DEXA scores. So T scores getting, arguably closer to 0. So I think that in most people, it is true that we can improve your bone mineral density through all the things that we do. Is there a point at which it's too late? I generally say the earlier, the better.
Right.
But we don't see people, we don't see women even know about it until in their 60s, right? So I have some patients that are in their 50s, 40s, and even younger that I'm trying to think of this, my last patient where it was a surprise. We looked at her DEXA scan that she got for body composition, and I was like, whoa, did you know you have osteoporosis?
Wow.
She was like, what?
Oh my gosh.
And I want to say she's late 30s. It was totally, athlete, totally surprised.
Oh crap.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, but I see it often.
Yeah, sure.
And so it just goes to show, no, she had no symptoms, strong, muscular, would never think, but she's had menstrual abnormalities most of her life. So she's had awkward, estrogen.
Yeah.
She's been on all kinds of things. So, But anyway, so the answer is yes. I think you can. It just, earlier the better.
Right.
For patients that come in and they're, they've had a hip fracture, they've had multiple spine fractures, say they're in their, 70s, 80s. Can we improve that? Absolutely. We can improve that. When you start getting, greater than 10 years or more out of menopause and you haven't been on hormone replacement, we start to lose some of our powerful tools like adding estrogen back. But there are still other things we can do. You can focus with the modalities, you can focus on nutrients, you can focus on the supplementation, adding in peptides, just kind of a fun space that you can really supplement things. So yeah, there's still things that you can do. It's never too late, but the impact that we can have starts to decline over time.
Right. So I feel like that's a good direction to go here, because if we're, I'm using air quotes here, like our regular doctor, whatever, they're not checking, right, their bone density until we're however old. I mean, how old do you think we should be getting these things checked? Yeah. I mean, you're saying the earlier the better, and you're seeing people in their 30s with the osteoporosis. Yeah. When is the time?
Yeah. So I talk on this a lot. And so if you look at the recommendations that come out of, let's say, Medicare, right? So CMS says, and this comes from the World Health Organization too, you should be tested for osteoporosis for women at age 65 and men at age 70, right? So these are the recommendations, and therefore that's when Medicare would pay for the scan. But that's not the entire recommendation. So I kind of I'll kind of point fingers at the World Health Organization and CMS. But really, if you look at what they're saying you don't need to be tested for this until 65 or 70. unless you have one of these risk factors.
Risk factors.
And if you dig into the risk factors, we all have those risk factors.
Of course.
Right?
It's like being alive.
Yeah. And so it's things that like you have to read into a little bit, but it's things like, have you ever, have you ever had an eating disorder? Have you ever had malnutrition? I'm like, how many people in this country, especially women, have been dieting their entire life?
Totally.
Right? Yep. How many women have had abnormal menstrual cycles? How many women have been exposed to tobacco? How many women have been, like the list goes on and on and on. You start like checking the boxes and you realize, oh my gosh, all of my patients have risk factors for osteoporosis, right? So when is the right time to do your initial test? I think if there were, because from a public health perspective, I can't even say this, but if you just ignore the financial aspect of this, then you say, well, actually, you should probably check everybody's bone mass in their early 20s, because then you would know.
Well, right. And like you're saying, the earlier, the better. And you're not waiting until you already have
because you reach your peak bone mineral density in your early 20s.
Okay.
And so if you are osteoporotic or osteopenic in your 22, my man, you got a big problem. But let's say you have, subpar bone density, you're not even osteopenic yet, but you're, like myself, I'm a good example. So in my early 20s, when I was in medical school, I had a DEXA scan done for a PhD project and I was osteopenic.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't even think about it. I was like, whatever, But you go back and think about it. Like I was raised in a household and my mom probably won't listen to this, so I'll just say it openly.
You can say it.
She did the best that she could at the time, but she really strongly believed that dietary fat was very bad for you and that, that we really had to not eat.
We all did in the 80s and 90s, right?
Yeah. So, I was eating like the snackable cookies and, and I was always trying to lose weight because I was always fat and hungry because I was eating carbohydrates all day long.
Right.
And so I kind of had this really unhealthy dietary lifestyle. And I was also like an endurance athlete. So, I had sort of like that side. So it actually doesn't surprise me that my T-score is not great.
Yeah.
But I think I didn't do anything about it. But you could have in that scenario said, hey, Doug, you really should, kind of focus on these things, which will help to slow down bone loss. Now, my T-score actually hasn't changed. I went back and looked. I just had it done recently. So it hasn't changed. I'm not at high risk of fracture. So I don't need to necessarily do anything about it. But if you got that study then, and then you got it again 5 years later and you're like, oh, wait, like you're actually losing bone in your 20s and 30s. Like that's a big deal.
Yeah, heck yeah.
Maybe you shouldn't be so calorie restricted. Maybe you should make sure you're getting the right supplementation. If you don't tolerate dairy, let's talk about where you're getting your calcium from.
Right.
All of those things matter because it's so much easier to slow down bone loss than it is to build up bone.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So as far as like the nutrition part, well, I guess nutrition and supplements, because these can kind of go together. So, I think, for so long it was the whole Got Milk campaign, right? But then now we know not everybody can drink milk.
Yeah.
So me included. So, and I know that's not the only place, but point is, what are your best nutritional recommendations for, I think at this point we're really talking about prevention, right? So how do we go about that?
Ideally. Now, we do build bone. So, there is both sides of that, right? But yeah, I would say the thing about dairy, I love dairy and I think dairy is great, but not only can not everybody tolerate it, it gets less tolerable as we age.
Right.
So, in my 50s and my 60-year-old patients, I'm surprised if they can tolerate dairy. And that's one of the things that we test. We look at the immune response to dairy and say, okay, can you consume milk? Can you consume any dairy product? Can you consume potentially other mammalian dairy products?
Right. Because
it is such a great source of dietary fat and calcium. And it's relatively well absorbed. Like if it's a tool you can use, it's a great tool.
Yeah.
But if you can't, then, calcium does come from other places. Generally, though, it's really hard. If you're not consuming dairy, it's hard to get that recommended 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium without supplementation. I see people that come in and they say, oh, I don't want to supplement, I don't want to take it, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, it's not bad to supplement,
Right.
You want to do it right. You don't want to do too much, but it's okay. It's okay to take a calcium supplement. I will say the caveat to that is make sure that you're taking it with vitamin D. You're taking it with vitamin K, preferably in the form. I'll just say this and you can write it down. So K2 is MK7. You really want to look for that form of it. And in the range of between 100 and 300 micrograms a day, preferably higher, I think is what we're finding. So I think vitamin K is going to become the new vitamin D.
I totally agree. And my listeners know this because I talked about vitamin K a few weeks ago. So you are reiterating it all. And I'm so glad you said that.
Great. Yeah. So anyway, I think it's okay to supplement calcium because it's really hard to get if you don't tolerate dairy, but make sure you're taking it, particularly with the K, so that you can absorb it, but then also put it in the right place, which is in your bones. As far as the dietary side, so I don't know anything about your beliefs on nutrition, so I'm going to say something that might be controversial. But what I will say is that the biggest issue I find with most of my patients is that they're protein deficient.
Yeah.
And so the recommendations for protein are woefully inadequate. And I see patients that come in and over the years, they start to eat less and less protein. What they don't know is that their body is processing less and less of the protein. Right. So it gets harder and harder to stay protein sufficient as we age. And so really we need to not eat less. We need to eat more protein. So my poor coaches, we have a coaching team that kind of works people through the nutrition side, and it's very hand-holding as much as you need along the way. And they have people track, and we'll see people that are eating, they're eating like 30, 40 grams of protein a day. That's it, and they say, well, but it's enough. I'm like, no, it's not. It's not enough.
Yeah.
And so, we kind of like step them up. My goal is to get them to around a gram per pound. And, even potentially more depending on, again, their gut function. So that's the biggest thing. And then here's the controversial part. That wasn't it. So the controversial part then is, where do you get the protein from? And I'm not opposed to people eating a vegan or vegetarian diet. The challenge is it is really hard to get that much protein from a vegan and vegetarian diet. So I see this all the time. I shouldn't say all the time. I see it frequently where somebody who's very health minded is eating a vegan diet. And what I see is that they have inadequate protein and they're getting more carbohydrates because all the protein sources that come from plants come with carbohydrates, right? Except for soy. And that's a whole other conversation. So I'm fine if you're eating a vegan or vegetarian diet for a specific reason, and we could talk about all of them, but for your bones, it is really not the best approach. So I definitely steer people away from that, getting them adequate protein. And then we have the conversation around the next question that you probably will have would be like the acid-base balance thing with eating animal protein.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. So this is one of the first things that I did a lot of research on when I started getting into this space, because I was looking at everything, online and on social media and on YouTube channels. And it's just like, it's the alkalize your diet, your diet, right? And I started looking, anybody that had citations, I would look up the citations and do a PubMed search and read the research. And it just left me like scratching my head as to the real evidence that supports this concept of alkalizing your diet. And it's all based on animal studies, but it's all based on the concept that if you consume, I'm using air quotes, quote unquote, acid forming foods, which by the way are every animal product out there, right? And added sugar and alcohol.
Right.
If you consume quote unquote acid forming foods, it will decrease your urine pH. So it'll make your pH more acidic, and you could see an increase in calcium excretion. So the assumption then is that you're breaking down your bones.
Right.
Now there is animal research that supports this idea. So if you give a rat or mouse, I forget which one, but one of those rodents, if you give them a calcium poor diet and you increase the nitrogen component, which is basically the acid forming part, they will actually lose bone mass. But repeat that study with an adequate calcium diet and they don't lose bone mass. And so,
that's the caveat.
Yeah. And so I think what's happened is that people who are advocates for eating a plant-only diet will take this information and say, see, you should exclude animal products. Right. And so then I say, well, but wait, why would you exclude the best protein source for your body? Why not just add the plants?
Right.
Totally. Like I'm not telling you to eat a carnivore diet.
Right. Totally.
There is certainly some value to plants, to fruits and vegetables. So if you want to alkalize your urine, which I argue is irrelevant, but if you want to, that's fine. Add fruits and vegetables. Don't get rid of the protein source.
Right.
And so that was actually the first video I made was on this whole concept, because I've never seen any human studies that would suggest that alkalizing your diet does anything beneficial. Even though even the people that I have been trained by, and I have mentors that still teach this, but I still don't understand why.
Yeah. No, I see that a lot. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'll tell you, I was 100% vegan for a long time. I mean, that was how I helped my body heal from IBS and all kinds of other stuff. So for me, it worked. But then it was kind of, to your point, it was the protein thing. And I realized, God, it's hard to get that much. I mean, unless you're eating like a bunch of fake stuff. And that wasn't the road I wanted to go down. So
Right.
for me, I eat fish is what some more like pescatarian now, but I'm majority plant-based, but I'm the same boat as you and that's what I tell my clients. Like I never turn and I have had a handful who were like totally vegan, and it's tough trying to help them with things. And especially when they're intolerant to things. And I'm like, well, you really shouldn't be, but the protein thing is huge. And I think my point was, I totally agree with your perspective. Because for me, I call it like plant focus. Like we don't have to take the meat out to make it plant focused. Let's just add more plants to your plate. And so that's me too. It's like, you don't have to be plant-based to be, whatever, but it's just adding more of the plants because we need all of that stuff. But I agree. It is hard to, and especially like you're saying as we age, and that's something I wanted to go back on because I find that with my clients that are menopausal and postmenopausal, and I have this conversation with them and talk about as you age and this happens in your metabolism and all these things. And we're talking about all these things and how they, break down the protein stuff. I have such a hard time getting my clients in that age group to increase their protein and to get to, because I'm in the same boat where I'm like, can we try to get to a gram like per? So do you have any recommendations for people? Because I think sometimes too, like you're saying, it also depends on your gut, right? There's like a tolerance level for some people, which, there's things to help with that, like digestive enzymes and stuff. But is there a way, or do you have strategies for people that you work with? Because you're in this realm a lot more.
Yeah.
How to increase this? Like, how do we get up to that ideal amount, especially for women?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me just take a step back and finish the vegan comment, because I don't want to disparage eating a vegan diet.
Yeah.
Because it can, well, I shouldn't say it is. It can be, the pure sense of it is a very clean approach to eating.
Yes.
And so it can be done well, but it's really hard.
Right.
And depending on your medical issues, it can actually, I think it could almost be impossible. And the one thing I want to bring up is that I see this often for people that have metabolic dysfunction. They're pre-diabetic or diabetic, and they decide to make this, dramatic dietary change and become vegan. All of a sudden, they're eating more carbohydrates, and their diabetes is getting worse, right? And so, for some people, it is a challenge. Now, you can't eat a low carbohydrate vegan diet, but you're just like more and more restricted.
It's hard.
Right? It's harder and harder and harder. Yep. So, when I see it, I just start asking the question, okay, why? Like, why are we doing this? And then you can kind of work through all those things. Yeah. As far as getting the right amount of protein, another question I often get is, what about fasting? Shouldn't I be fasting? Mm-hmm. And I think there's some interesting research on fasting. And I used to be a big advocate, and I was doing, 16-8 feeding windows and all these things. But what I found is it's really hard to get adequate protein if you skip meals.
Yep.
And so I've really backed away from that. And particularly most of my bone health patients are not overweight. Right. And so they're fasting generally either out of convenience, like somebody gave them permission, right? They're like, oh, cool, I don't need to eat.
Right.
Or, they're doing it because they think that there's a longevity benefit, the concept of autophagy or cellular senescence. But the research, I'm actually doing a talk, all right, when we're done, on, to physicians about the research in the longevity space. And boy, it's really not clear. Like, what are you actually doing? Even with especially a 16-8 window, are you getting any benefit there?
Right.
Now, I'd argue metabolically, you're emptying out your glycogen stores, and there's some value there, particularly if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, but probably not from an autophagy perspective, probably not from a longevity perspective. Yeah. It's just not long enough.
Right.
And to do that consistently, you're really then trading, getting adequate nutrition, which we know is, if you start adding up micronutrients, it's really hard to do. Eating 3 or 4 meals a day. If you cut half of those out, it's impossible.
Right.
So that's the number one thing I would say, is make sure that you're actually eating 3 or 4 meals a day. Now, that doesn't mean you need to eat right when you get up. You know, I don't eat until after I work out in the morning, and that's usually around 10. But I still get 4 meals in.
Yep.
And so for me, I'm getting 200 plus grams of protein in, but it takes 4 meals to do that. And all of my meals are protein focused.
Right.
So when I'm thinking, what am I going to eat for this meal? Really what I'm asking is, what is my protein source? And then what am I going to put around it?
Right.
And so when you start framing how you're going to eat around that, you say, okay, well, I need to get at minimum 30 grams of protein per meal.
Right.
That's how you get there. If you're not tracking, you're not thinking about it, and you just think it's going to happen, it's not.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a point. I think that's a huge thing too, is I help my clients with kind of, and it's not necessarily even about portioning it, but it's at least know, because I'm usually like, let's, aim for 25 to 30 grams every time you eat. Well, no, most people don't even know what that looks like. So let's measure it out for a little while and kind of
it's
see.
not that much.
It's really not.
Like,
it's really not.
I mean, 4 ounces of some kind of an animal protein.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That gets you
It's
there.
really not. Yeah. It's really not. Yeah. No, such a conversation. And I'm glad you brought up the acidic versus alkaline. And that's really interesting because I feel the same way. And I've kind of heard different sides of it, but I find it interesting that there's no real clear, like, evidence on things. I just find that's interesting.
But for the human evidence, they point to the idea of like, well, if you eat a Mediterranean diet, or if you look at the vegan and vegetarian literature, right? Like, oh, they're healthier. Well, yeah, but any diet that's different than our terrible diet is going to make you healthier,
doesn't
right?
take much.
And so the thing that's happened now is you start looking at, now the studies are small, but start looking at the carnivore literature and you see the same improvements in health, right? So clearly it's not from alkalizing your diet because they're eating pure, like all nitrogen containing foods. Right. So it's not like it's from restricting other things and the benefits of fruits and vegetables, but the pH of your urine is irrelevant.
Right. Yeah. No, that's such a good point. So when we're looking at supplements, we mentioned some. Are there any other supplements that we should be looking at? Because you mentioned the calcium with the D and the K2. Are there any other supplements that can help with this?
Early on, I was trying to create sort of like the perfect supplement list without testing. Because I think it is, we have kind of 2 missions in our practice. One is obviously to serve our patients, but the other one is to just educate. And this is where I'm actually spending more of my time is, doing podcasting and creating YouTube videos. And obviously we can't test through those avenues.
Right.
So in that work, what I realized is that it's all different. Everybody's different, but there are some general recommendations. So we already talked about vitamin D. We talked about vitamin K. We talked about calcium. I would just throw in a little bit more information on calcium because there's a lot of terrible calcium supplements out there. So the kind of 2 forms of calcium that I like, one is calcium hydroxyapatite, which is not that easy to find. There's a couple out there. So the reason why I like it is because there's good evidence to say that it will actually go to your bones, number one, and number 2, it'll have an impact on bone mineral density. So evidence to support using that product. The challenge with it is it comes in like big, bulky, chalky tablets, right? Like it's hard to eat. And then the other form of calcium that I am recommending for patients is a plant form from the company Algical. I have no relationship with them. But the reason why I bring it up is that they have good evidence supporting their products. And I don't actually love the rest of the stuff that's in there. So sorry, Algical. I think they could do a better job, but it is one of the best products in the market. So kind of those 2 calcium forms, I think are probably the best things you can get right now. I'm working with a company right now. I think we're going to have to make our own because there's just there's a need for that. So keep an eye out for that. Optimal bone health calcium is coming.
I love it.
I don't know when. And so that's the calcium piece. Other minerals that are really important around that. So magnesium. Most people, so we test red blood cell magnesium on everybody. I don't know anybody that has enough magnesium that isn't supplementing magnesium.
I see that. Yep.
Yeah. Are you doing testing in your
clinical practice?
Yeah, that's great. So then what else? I think things that I typically see people are deficient in that we test would be zinc. Zinc's one you do have to be careful with. So you can't just blanket take a bunch of zinc.
Right.
One that I would like to test, but that's one that people are often on. What else off the top of my head? So people get kind of like stuck on some of the micronutrients like boron and, like they're important, but it's not the big picture.
Right.
And then there's like the controversial ones like strontium, like should you take strontium if you're familiar with that? Again, like it's an interesting conversation, but it's not the big picture. That's not the magic bullet to your bone problem.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, those are all the recommendations you gave. Y'all should go back and take notes on this too, because those are all really important. And like you said, I mean, I think, everybody is different. And I think that's why you do the testing, right? Because like you said, especially like you mentioned zinc, knowing that that's not one that you just want to take as much as, you want to test and know exactly like what you're deficient in. And
I've seen some really high levels in zinc in people that with the pandemic, they started taking, 50, 100 milligrams of zinc every day. And you're like, whoa, you don't have any copper, by the way.
No kidding. And it blows my mind that people can stomach that much. I would be on the floor, like in pain, taking that much zinc. It's crazy. Yeah. Yes, those are all really good. Okay. So I have another question I want to ask you that I like to finish up with, but as we're wrapping up, I want to ask you this first. This is just for my own curiosity for you. What are your thoughts on, so I have a brick and mortar Pilates and fitness studio. So what are your thoughts on using Pilates to help with bone health?
Yeah. So coincidentally, we just onboarded a company, I don't know if you're familiar with them, called Buff Bones.
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. So Rebecca and I've been chatting for a while. We met through social media, ironically.
Yeah.
So we've been chatting for a while, and we actually were just able to onboard her program into ours.
That's
So obviously she
amazing.
still has her own thing and exists outside of ours. But for our patients, we have a backside of our program, which now they have access to these videos.
That's amazing.
As well as a bunch of other stuff that we're creating. Yeah. So I think that there's certainly value, and it's something that most people can do. And that's where I think it really applies. And her program, there are all different levels. So I really like it. Now, that said, I think that shouldn't be the only thing.
Right.
And if you look at the studies, I'm blanking on the study called Lift More, it's actually in the title, like LIFTMOR. So if you look at that study, it was really interesting. It was a relatively short study window. I forget the duration, but it was just a couple of months. And the exercises they were doing were really impressive because they were taking untrained individuals with osteoporosis, doing, compound movements like squatting. And I don't know if they were doing deadlifting, but that kind of like multi-joint, right? Complex stuff with very significant weight, like 80% of max. I mean, high weight.
Yeah.
Obviously they're monitored and people looking for form and so forth, but they also did impact training. So taking these untrained patients with osteoporosis and actually having them jump off of stuff.
Oh my gosh.
I know I would never design this study, but what was impressive is they had significant impact in impact's not the right word, significant change in their DEXA, which usually takes, 1 to 2 years to see any difference in just that short time period.
Oh, that's crazy.
I do think that you can do more. And this is where the challenge we've had as a telehealth company is saying, well, I don't want to tell people to start jumping off stuff that have osteoporosis. That sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Right.
So we've kind of encouraged people to work with somebody locally, but something like yoga, you really you can say, hey, look, this is the technique, this is non-impact. So again, something everybody can do, but it shouldn't be the only thing that they do.
Right. Yeah. Would you say, because we do ours is like Pilates based. So we have some HIIT classes, bar, we have a bunch of everything. We have the performers and all that. Would you say, so for as far as exercise for bone health, was weight training, what's your number one? I don't want to put out, what's your number one? This is what you should be doing.
Yeah. I think it's resistance training, and whatever that means to you. So, bands are a nice way to try to not injure yourself. And the number one rule for me is don't injure yourself.
Yep.
Because injuries can take so long to recover from. And the older we get, the harder that gets, right? So number one, don't injure yourself. But if you can do resistance training, I like free weights because of all of the, the coordination that goes along with it. Right. And, to the point where do it as heavy as you can, again, adhering to number one rule, which is don't injure yourself. So I think resistance training is probably the most important part. And it's the part that most people phase out as they age. They start well, I used to have weights, but now I don't, And I see a lot of people that if I just walk, it'll be okay. But that's actually been clearly studied. And the answer is that doesn't do anything for your bones. So it has to be something where you're pushing. Now, the great thing about Pilates, there are some interesting forms of Pilates you're probably familiar with. I'm thinking of, the company Legree.
Legree. Yeah. The Megaformer.
Yeah. So, my wife and I love to take that class, and it's low impact, but it is a lot of resistance, right? It is time under tension, and that tension is going to build your muscles. It's going to build your bones.
Yep. I love it.
Yeah.
And that's what Pilates does, y'all. This a little promo for Pilates there.
Totally. Yeah.
I love it. Okay. So now I do want to finish with a question, but before I ask you the last question, can you let everybody know where the best place is to find out more about you and all the programs, your telehealth company, where they can work with you? Yeah,
absolutely. So most of our information is on our website at optimalbonehealth.com. We also have, again, the parent company, Optimal Human Health, but all the bone health specific stuff is on that URL. That's why we created it. We're spending a lot of time and effort right now on our YouTube channel. So if you look up Dr. Doug Lucas on YouTube, you'll find that. If you search anything bone health, you'll probably find us at this point, which is great. And then other social media platforms, Dr. Doug Lucas, Instagram and Facebook, we're on there as well.
Perfect. All right. I'll have all that in the show notes so you can go check them out. And the last question that I like to finish with is, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
Gosh, I think it is just to find your mission. I don't want to use the word purpose again, but this is really certainly in my own journey, coming from a traditional medical background where I was a well-trained orthopedic surgeon, Stanford grad orthopedic surgeon, but it wasn't my mission. And I was really unhappy. And so even though lots of achievement, wasn't where I was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that often, particularly in the medical field, where people go into it for one reason or another, but it's just that's not them. It's not what they're passionate about. It's not what they want to do for people. So for me and for a lot of my peers, it's, finding what is your mission. And that's really what I'm passing on to my kids. Same thing, don't look at it for all the things that you're told to look at it, but really like what's in your heart.
I love that. That's so good. I love that. It's a great way to end, great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Doug. This was awesome. And I'm going to say y'all should go back and take notes again on everything that Dr. Doug just said. This was really good stuff. Lots of nuggets. I appreciate your time and insight on all of this, Dr. Doug.
Awesome. Thank you, Hope.
Thanks for listening to Hopeful and Wholesome, y'all. If you found value in this week's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review to let me know what you thought. I'd love to know what you find useful in these episodes so I know how I can provide the most value I can to my listeners. And if you have topics that you want to know more about, I'd love to hear those as well. So shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. It's @TheHopePedraza, or visit my website, hopefulandwholesome.com. Thanks, y'all.